Well, regular readers of my Substack page will know that I was in Shanghai just 2 weeks ago, 1 week before our esteemed Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, visited the city with a delegation of top corporate executives to talk business, followed by a high level meeting with President Xi Jinping in Beijing. Now, what struck me about Shanghai, it was my first visit there, was just how commercial and Western the place is. I mean, for example, the original meeting place of the Chinese Communist Party is in downtown Shanghai. They met there for the first time in 1921, and the place is preserved as a museum and heavily guarded by armed policemen or soldiers or whatever. But the thing that struck me was that it was surrounded by Western retail shops, boutiques, and bars and restaurants. So perhaps that was the point of Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's visit to China, to continue this westification of the emerging Asian superpower. Is that really the case? Let's talk to one of Australia's leading and boldest China commentators, Andrew Phelan, about it. Andrew, welcome.
G'day, Fred. Good to be with you.
What was the purpose of this visit?
Well, first of all, just on your points on your trip to Shanghai, glad you got up there, and I encourage people to go up to China and have a look. But all is sometimes not as it appears in China. Just because there's neon and restaurants and European fashion boutiques and the odd, golden arches, it means it's modernized. I wouldn't say it's westernized. They're two very different things. And of course, Shanghai has always been, Shang meaning on, Hai meaning sea, so literally on the sea, has always been the most cosmopolitan and most Western-facing city in China. And I think the people have associated foreigners, and there's a lot less foreigners in Shanghai now than there was, say in the 2000s when the place was booming with foreign investment, which has dropped off a cliff, than there is now. But
I agree. I just should have pointed out actually that it's a superficial observation. It was my first trip there, and I didn't go beyond Shanghai. And you don't have to be Sherlock Holmes to know that this is that it is all on the surface. I mean, one of the things that struck me about China is just how, without being too offensive, that they're very robotic people. They're all glued to their phones as they walk around and travel on the trains and so on. And I did meet some nice Chinese people, but they're not very engaging. They don't have much of a sense of humor. They'll yell at you if you lie down on a park bench and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, there are vast differences, and I was being facetious by suggesting that Anthony Albanese was up there to encourage China to become more and more Western, because obviously that's not the case. So what was the point?
Yeah. I'm sure you strolled on the Bund, and in the old days there used to be the PSB officers keeping an eye. These days there's a million CCTV cameras. In fact, China now has one CCTV camera, and the latest ones have facial recognition for every two people in the country, which is a staggering statistic when you think about it, right?
Wow.
What was the purpose of the visit? I think the Labor government under Albanese have tried to cultivate this narrative of, the LNP stuffed up with China. They wrecked the relationship. We came in, and you'll hear this from time to time. Our patient calibrated approach got things back on track, and now that things are back on track, they've been quote unquote normalized, and now we're taking them to beyond normalization. And I just don't see things that way at all. I think Labor and the CCP have had a symbiotic relationship, right? You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. So, in return for cooperating with the CCP party state, they in turn have made it very clear, crystal clear, who their preferred Australian government is. And nobody in the country is talking about how that is a manifest interference. China's always saying we don't interfere in other countries' internal affairs, which is a bold-faced lie. They
Yeah.
always interfere in other countries' internal affairs. And they're saying, hey, CCP endorses the Labor Party. We don't like the other guys because the other guys have got us worked out more. They're going to give us a harder time. And so we'll do some win-win cooperation with the Labor Party. But joking aside, I think it's a real assault on our democracy.
It is. And it's also clear that they would prefer us, well, Labor's made it clear as well, that the relationship with China, Australia's relationship with China, is more important than its relationship with the US.
Yeah, I think Albanese's in way over his head on this stuff,
Yeah.
to be
Yeah.
quite frank. I think he's got poor self-awareness. And I think he thinks he's won a second election and he's now in the pantheon of Labor greats, can be mentioned in the same sentence as the late, great John Curtin. Now, John Curtin was a truly great Australian and a great wartime Prime Minister and acted incredibly courageously without with taking high risk and decisively in the nation's national interest. I don't see those attributes in the current PM. I see the opposite. If we do a throwback to those heady days, we had a industrialist, a guy called Essington Lewis, who went on to lead BHP and later he went to Japan pre-war and really surveilled the military industrial complex in Japan and came back to Australia with those learnings to share to prepare us for the likelihood of Imperial Japan going on the warpath in our region. And he later became the Minister of Munitions in World War II, really critical role in a war economy. And so I don't see that sense of the imminent danger, the imminent risk. And I don't see us preparing our nation for that contingency.
Well,
And
yeah. Can I just
I'm
butt in there? Because the Albanese is not coming back with any insight into China. I mean, he's gone up there. Let me just call up the quote here. He's gone up there and he's said, Australia's renewable. We want a sustainable global steel sector while we work to lower emissions. Today, I've brought Australian mining and Chinese steelmaking CEOs together in Shanghai to collaborate on decarbonisation. I mean, as if China gives two tosses about decarbonisation.
Yeah, that whole green steel thing is fantasy. I mean, I went out to Shougang, the capital iron and steel works, in 1990 on the outskirts of Beijing. That plant employed 100,000 people
Wow.
back in the day.
Wow.
The numbers of China are always staggering, but the
Yeah.
air quality in Beijing back in those days was so bad. But it's been shut down since. You could see the old chimney stacks. They were on the side of the ski jump event during the Winter Olympics. But you know, competition inside China is cutthroat in EVs, in steelmaking, in flat panel TVs. And it's always been a low margin race to the bottom because the Chinese economy, I mean, this idea that China's a free trader, China doesn't do free trade. I mean, I don't know how many times we have to say it, but there's so many subsidies, soft lending from state-owned banks, subsidies to industry, subsidies to consumers, tariff and non-tariff barriers on foreign competition. And it's a very distorted market. And consequently, if you look at, say, the automobile market, they make twice what they can consume annually. So where does the product go?
Yeah.
Just near where I live in Melbourne, there are a couple of outdoor warehouses where there is hundreds of BYD vehicles sitting there. They're not in car yards; they're just in these warehouses, sitting and doing nothing.
Really?
Yeah, oh yeah, and BYD's expanding. They're building a brand new factory in China, which is of such colossal scale that if I quoted the numbers, you probably wouldn't believe me. They were also trying to build a factory in Brazil. They got in a bit of trouble in Brazil because the local authorities accused them of of the construction crew building the factory being in slave-like conditions, which is another
Well,
point. I mean, none of the ex-union people that are on Labor's side, you'll never hear them talk about labor conditions in China. And yet,
no, and well, you won't hear leftists complain about Uyghur slaves building the iPhones that they talk to each other on. But
yeah, well, what's happened with the Uyghurs is because it's a prickly issue for the government in Beijing, they're now trucking or training Uyghurs outside of Xinjiang to do slave labor in other provinces where they can't be traced. Or I mean, they don't allow people into Xinjiang anyway.
yeah,
But,
yeah.
we're hoovering in lots of junk from Timu and Shein. I mean, Indonesia's banned Timu because of the effect it had on their local industry and
Oh,
commerce.
really?
Yeah,
Yeah. Well, it's
the
everywhere
French,
here in Australia.
yeah,
But
the
just
French,
getting back, Andrew, just getting back to the theme of this trip
yeah,
for Anthony Albanese.
yeah,
I mean, obviously, he was trying to capitalize on Australia collaborating with China to reduce carbon emissions.
yeah,
Now, it's extraordinarily coincidental because yesterday Ted Cruz, the senator in the United States,
yeah,
was in a congressional hearing, and he was talking about how the Chinese Communist Party is financing radical environmentalism in the United
yeah.
States. And he described it. There was quite a long hearing, of course, but the key quote for me was, this is Ted Cruz, a cozy financial partnership between leftist billionaires. Well, there was a couple of those on Albanese's delegation. Radical environmental organisations. Well, that's what you'd call the Australian Labor Party and the Chinese Communist Party. So that's Ted Cruz saying this is a major problem in the United States. He may as well have been describing Anthony Albanese's delegation to China.
Yeah, there's a guy. I'm just looking up the founder, his name. That there's an organization, leftist organization in the US called Code Pink,
Yeah,
and it's we're all about peace. We're a bunch of peaceniks, and
yeah,
the guy that the billionaire that funds it spends a lot of time in China, and he's working with the CCP. They've funded Black Lives Matter. They've funded all sorts of left wing organizations. This is what they do subversively.
yeah.
Um, they've also through TikTok they've had a massive influence on the young people's thinking, particularly in terms of the Palestinian-Israel conflict. They've been, if you like, grooming the narrative in favor of the Palestinian cause, and I think to some degree encouraging militancy. It's interesting that the founder of Code Pink, whose name escapes me at the moment, it'll come back to me, but he's now being asked to testify in front of Congress. So the Americans are finally onto him. And we have similar organisations and groups here in Australia that go into bat for Beijing. They do it very subtly, and they
Well, there's the Box Hill Football Club, which you mentioned to me the other day.
well, I mean, it's like they've been caught trying to interfere with elections in Canada. In the United States, there was a very big story. The state of New York, the governor of New York, Kathy Hochul, New York being the second biggest economy in the US, one of her assistants, a lady by the name of Linda Swin, has now been charged. Her and her husband have been charged by the FBI for basically being proxies and behaving on Beijing's behalf. That'll go to court. She'll be found guilty. But she was doing things, in her role working for the New York governor, of pouring cold water on potential visits from delegations from Taiwan, shutting out, anyone, talking about the Tibetan cause and so on. So really doing Beijing's work for it covertly inside a Western political organization. And
How
this
are
is
they doing it here in Australia? What's
yeah,
the equivalent in Australia? It's in the universities, isn't it?
yeah, it's a great question, Fred. First of all, we have the foreign interference legislation. There's only been one case that's gone to court since that legislation came out. There's maybe one or two others that are being investigated. The case that did go to court was the case of Sunny Dong, who was a Cambodian Chinese that had been courted by what they call the United Front Work Department, which is Xi Jinping has referred to it as China's magic weapon. And the idea behind the United Front is to orchestrate through the ethnic Chinese diaspora to get people to covertly do Beijing's policy work or Beijing's bidding. Now, Sunny Dwong was found guilty of those charges. He presented a check to then Health Minister Alan Tudge. So they had a project, they were grooming Alan Tudge. They thought he might have been a future prime minister. They play a very long, slow game here, and they use a bunch of different tools and weapons to get people to bat for Beijing. Absolutely the university system.
Yep.
And the most egregious example of that is ACRI UTS, University of Technology Sydney, the most China-friendly university in the country. And there's a bunch of them. But that is...
It's a high bar, that one. Yeah, go on.
It really is. I mean, Chow Chak Wing, there's a building named after him. He was mentioned under parliamentary privilege by the late Kimberley Kitching as the guy that ASIO referred to as the puppet master. And he's also, the Nine Papers also, he sued the Nine Papers and won, actually. So he's got the pocketbooks for lawfare. But ACRI UTS, the Australia-China Relations Institute, is funded by John Holland, which is Chinese-owned and one of the Chinese banks.
I think we should just repeat that, because you did mention this to me in conversation the other day. I never knew John Holland was China-owned, and it's everywhere. It's a major construction company. How did it become China-owned?
When I first went to China, there was they back in the 80s, there was a magazine in English they used to put out called China Reconstructs. It just had all these construction projects, pictures of, all around the country. And the quality of construction was terrible. Like they didn't know how to make glass properly. On windy days, the glass would crack. I mean, arguably today, the quality of construction is not that great. But so they've done acquisitions around the world to improve their capacity. Now, John Holland, a century-old Australian civil engineering company, was sold to China Communications and Construction Corporation, a state-owned enterprise. It went through the FIRB. It was signed off by then Treasurer Joe Hockey. And it's an example, and there's a bunch of them, of selling key, important, sovereign bits of Australian industry to PRC interests that, in my view, should not have happened, were major mistakes. And, I'll give credit where due. With the benefit of hindsight, there are Australian politicians who have said, if I knew better back then, I would have acted differently. And Tony Abbott's an example of that. Chris Minns is an example of that, to both of their credit. But there's others like Andrew Robb who, went to work for Landbridge, the state-owned enterprise that has a 99-year lease on the Port of Darwin. That deal was done pretty much in isolation by Adam Giles when he was the territory administrator. There's a picture of him with his arm around Chengye, the Landbridge guy, and he's having a wine and, yay, here we go. A couple of days later in a presser, he was said, well, this Chinese language document says that Landbridge has very close ties with the PLA. And Gilesy sort of went, we probably should get that translated. Too late, mate. You've already signed the contract. So at the time, Turnbull was like, whoops, the Northern Territory is 15% of our land mass and, 1% or whatever it is of our population. But, Darwin is our one and only North Coast port. And to sign that away...
Albo claims to have brought this up in Beijing. What's your prediction of how this will pan out? Will the Landbridge lease be cancelled or bought out?
Well, he didn't bring it up in his meeting with Xi. And it's really important to understand how negotiations and these dynamics work and how Xi Jinping works. And I've been in a truckload of them, not just in China, but in other parts of Asia over the years. And the nitty-gritty doesn't happen in a meeting like yesterday's meeting with Xi. The press pack, they seem to think so because, the people that are covering this, they're a certain network's chief political correspondent for 51 weeks of the year. And then for 1 week of the year, they're covering China. And they have no China background, no commercial background, no experience in Asia. no idea what it's like to get a value-added finished product into some of these markets, distributed and sold. And contentious issues were not going to be up for discussion in that meeting. That meeting, from China's point of view, was about saying, we've got Albo and Labor and Australia more or less where we want them. We want to keep that going, so we'll keep the grooming going.
But
Uh,
will Landbridge retain its lease?
Landbridge will dig its teeth in like nobody's business. China will not want to give up that access, right? Now, at the time, and this really disappointed me, people like our former ambassador to the US and former head of ASIO, what's his name? Richardson, I think, said that, where Landbridge is on the Port of Darwin, they're going to have they may as well be a fish and chip shop for all the access that they've got. And 99 years is a long time, and we've seen how much warfare has changed through the war in Ukraine. But we've also seen. I mean, China's the world leader in drones, and they've done little tests where they've flown them in and out of the US. They toyed with the US Coast Guard vessel off the coast of California. So picture this: a Chinese merchant marine vessel comes into the port of Darwin, and it looks like a civilian vessel. It opens up at the top, and a swarm of drones comes out and starts shooting at things in Darwin. I mean, there's no way that we would be able to prevent that happening when in the current situation, that sort of Trojan horse attacked. And the United States is investing heavily in our north and our west, so that it has a footprint here, with safe distance from the theatre, and they're rightly peeved that was allowed to happen. Now, Albanese said yesterday, he's very quick to jump on the LNP for doing that deal, and this was a case of, let me see if I've got it handy. Not right behind me. I'm not over that shoulder. I'm looking for a study called "Taking the Low Road" on how China deliberately targets subnational governments, state governments, provincial governments, and even local governments to get what it wants, because it knows at that level they don't have typically the resources and the knowledge to counter what they're doing. The New York governor's case is an example.
Victoria is another example.
Well, Victoria, that's a whole separate podcast right there on Victoria.
Yeah. We'll skip past that. Yeah, go on.
If you don't get me started on that, Fred, because that's, but we can do that another day. But they're very good at that, including, by the way, brushing up to local police forces. Speaking of the Box Hill Hawks, at Box Hill Police Station a few years ago, they were raising the PRC flag on October 1, their Independence Day. Outrageous.
Yeah.
Local police have no business in doing that stuff at all. Can
I just draw back a little bit and talk about where we are in the longer term, because that's the perspective that Chinese people take. So Mao, one of the things I was kind of surprised at, but I shouldn't have been, was that Mao's childhood home in Shanghai has also been preserved, and it's a museum and it's free to get in, and there's lots of Mao deification inside it. And, this is a man who killed 40 to 80 million of his own citizens, but he's still revered. So one of the greatest sort of despots in world history, but he's still revered in China because, as any Chinese person will tell you, he unified the country after it had been humiliated, the previous century in the Opium Wars and so on. So he's still revered. So Mao brought the country back together. Subsequent leaders, especially Deng Xiaoping, made it strong again, made it reasonably prosperous and on the up. And now we've got Xi Jinping, whose aspirations are the next stage of that long-term phase. What's your take on that? And how does it affect Australia?
It's a really good point. I'm glad you brought that up. In fact, Peter Stefanovich was quite generous with this time this morning, and at the end I made a point, pretty much exactly what you're talking about. Sarah Payne, who's a brilliant historian at the US Naval War College, I love her work. She refers to Mao Zedong as putting Humpty Dumpty back together again after the trials and tribulations of 150 years or 100 years of what Xi Jinping calls the century of humiliation, followed by the invasion from the Japanese and then subsequently the Civil War. And, Chairman Mao declared the People's Republic of China, established on October 1, 1949. And shortly after that, any free-riding capitalists, anyone that wasn't on board, you essentially had a choice after that date, which was you're either with us or you take a bullet. Which would you rather do? So most people said, yeah, sure, I'm with you. But just looking at the history and going back to the continuity, the long game, as you were talking about, Chairman Mao did unite the country, similar to Emperor Qin Shi Huang, which the Terracotta Warriors. That's that era. And so he's revered for that, and Xi Jinping also is an admirer of Chairman Mao. And also in China, there's a real lack of spiritual icons. So some less educated people in the countryside, J.D. Vance used the word peasants recently and was criticized for it. In Chinese Communist Party dogma, they use the word peasants all the time. But these are country people that are not well educated, and some of them literally kind of worship Chairman Mao. But as in terms of running the country and the governance of China, he was a disaster. So they had this thing called the Great Leap Forward, which was designed to match and outpace the steel production of Britain. And so they had all these backyard furnaces where people were taking their pots and pans and trying to it was a complete disaster, and it resulted in famine on an enormous scale. Now, when Mao's revolutionary brothers were kind of tapping him on the shoulder saying, hey, buddy, it's time for you to move on. This isn't working out so well. He launched the Cultural Revolution to throw his enemies into, a pit of fire. And so from 66 to 76, the first 10 years, which coincided with the first 10 years of my life. And when I make that point because, I grew up in an era where Australia had no relations with China at all. There was next to nothing. And we prospered. We might not have been as rich as we are now, but we prospered. And I wasn't wanting for anything. And I had a happy childhood in Australia, And my point being that everyone says you've got to engage, you must engage. The truth of the matter is we don't. We don't. There's on the continuum of negotiations, at the far extreme, there's one that says we don't have to have diplomatic ties with China. We could have them with Taiwan. Now, I'm not saying we should do that, but in the continuum of a position, that is there. So moving on, Gough Whitlam went to China in 1970, met with Chairman Mao. Nice job, Chairman Mao, being responsible for the deaths of 50 million people. He put Stalin in the shade.
Yeah.
Nobody talks about that, And really, Deng Xiaoping is arguably the most significant person, or certainly one of them, of the 20th century, because he and Zhou Enlai had spent a significant part of, unlike Mao, who never went out of China, they'd spent a significant part of their youth in France. They were very influenced, as were a lot of early nationalists at that point, influenced by the Western idea of the nation state, the ideas of independence, freedom, and so on. So I think Deng was, more broad-minded, and
Well, he was also able to sort of deceive his Western counterparts because he came across as a kind of a Western enthusiast, didn't he?
Well, he was very pragmatic, to his credit. So he said, look, we're poor, we're dirt poor, and we need science, we need technology. They had flirtations with the Russians, but he said, let's open up to the world, not carte blanche, like radical change, like perestroika and glasnost in Russia, but let's pick a few what they called special economic zones and say, okay, these are going to have different tax treatment, different treatment for foreign investors, and we'll see how that goes. One of the famous quotes attributed to Deng is crossing the river feeling for stones, So he was pragmatic. We'll see
What
how
does
we
that
go.
mean? What does that mean? Just
It
treading
means,
carefully.
yeah, treading carefully, checking our progress as we go.
Right.
He's also famous for saying it doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white, so long as it catches the mice. And I love that. I love that quote. He also said, "To get rich is glorious," and boy, did that cotton on.
Yeah,
you know,
that got traction.
oh boy.
He also said,
I mean, the Chinese are inherently hardworking, entrepreneurial, want to get ahead, and it's like, oh my God, this guy's just given us the blessing. We're going to
yeah,
go out and get rich and make money, and we're going to flaunt it. Every high end brand and all the rest of it. If we're rich, you're going to know about it. Uh,
yeah, and you do in Shanghai. He also said, "Hide your strength and bide your time." Didn't he?
yes, yes,
So that brings me back to that question. Is like, where are we now in that
mm,
on that broad perspective that the
yeah,
Chinese take? Under Xi
yeah.
Jinping, he's not hiding his strength anymore.
No, that's a
He's not biding
really,
his time
really
either.
important. That's a really important point. So, you know, little Deng Xiaoping, diminutive guy from Sichuan, chain smoker. He went to Texas. He went to the rodeo. They put a cowboy hat on him. When Bush #1 was president, and hide your strength, bide your time was the dogma, the mantra that everybody stuck to round about until 2008. What changed in 2008? Of course, we had the financial crisis, led by Lehman Brothers and, what's his name with the Ponzi scheme and everything that ended up in dying in jail.
Oh
Uh,
yeah,
yeah, and all the rest of it. And of course, Beijing held the 2008 Olympics, which is something of a coming out party. And so, hide your strength, bide your time kind of was slowly and gradually put out to pasture. And then we had this guy that I sort of, me personally in my journey, wasn't clear that China was going to open up and liberalize more or not. It became clear to me in about 2011 where China was going, and that's when I first started to voice my opinion and speak publicly. Although I was still based in Asia at the time, so I was careful about where I did it. Um, and so Xi Jinping has brought in an era of said, hang on a minute, the US model wasn't perfect. Look at 2008. We're now pretty big and pretty powerful and pretty muscular. I don't think we need to hide our strength anymore. I think we need to start, flexing our muscles a bit. And so we saw this transition to a very assertive China. And to your point about the continuity, and it's not particularly linear, but there's one of Trump's advisors in his first term wrote a book called Michael Pillsbury wrote a book called The 100-Year Marathon. And the premise of that book is, founded in 1949, by 2049, we want to be the undisputed heavyweight in the world. We want to be the dominant power. And there's an intermediate step with that. And that's where we're at the moment. China wants to be the undisputed regional hegemon in the Indo-Pacific. And that's where these tectonic plates between it and the US are rubbing up against each other as we speak. But if it's successful in doing that, it becomes significantly more powerful than it is today. And just to cut to the chase here, from an Australian perspective, very few people have been talking about there's those on the left are saying we don't want to get involved with Taiwan, we don't want to commit to Taiwan, we're for peace. We followed the US into disastrous wars, which we have, Iraq and Afghanistan to name two,
yeah.
and other wars that have been justified, like the Korean War, and the Pacific War and World War II. But let's talk for a second about Taiwan. What happens if Australia sits out? First of all, if Australia sits out, the alliance with the US is kaput. It's
Yep.
over. It's history.
Yep.
That's the first point. Second point is that what if Xi Jinping is successful in his attempt to annex Taiwan and bring it into a greater China? What does the world look like in that scenario? Well, what it looks like is the US completely withdraws from the Western Pacific. I mean, Guam is no longer viable, so they're all the way back to Hawaii. They're out of the region. US military is out of the region. They withdraw from Okinawa, they're off the Korean Peninsula, and those two locations more than likely get hit by missiles during that conflict. Japan would definitely be in that conflict, regardless of who the prime minister is, because it's existential for them. So
Yep.
they're in. There's an ongoing. They probably go nuclear to protect themselves. They develop a nuclear weapon. South Korea, I mean, remains to be seen what happens to that. They have a very capable military. But then the dust starts to settle. What does this mean for Australia? So all of a sudden, we are completely isolated from our number one security guarantor and ally, the United States. Now, if you think China was beating us up over the COVID pandemic with coercion and influencing our elections and these other sorts of things, have a think about what it looks like when Australia's on its own. Southeast Asia, ASEAN, 600 million people, really falls under Beijing's sway. They're powerless. Beijing's 30%, 35, 40% more powerful than it is today. Have a think about that. Where does that leave Australia?
So what would they do? I mean, Australia has a huge Chinese population already and a lot of Chinese investment. I mean, they're not going to bomb us into smithereens, are they? What would they do?
Well, I think, first of all, they'd want to bed down Taiwan, and that would take them some time. But longer term, their influence over Australia and the pressure that they would put on Australia would ramp up significantly. Then say you get to about 2049, 2050, mid-century, then they don't respect our sovereignty. They don't respect most countries' sovereignty. And, there's the left-wing activities that they fund are very much, Australia was colonized by the British. The British colonized Hong Kong, etc. You see where that kind of line of thinking is going. And then you want my honest opinion?
Yeah.
I think by about 2050, they start seriously looking at a military attack and invasion of Australia, as something that becomes their sovereign possession, in effect, their colony. I think that's quite plausible.
Can I just get back to, just as a further insight into the way the CCP thinks, it's amazing when you actually go to these places and the reality of it hits you. I met a guy in Shanghai who described what it was like during those COVID lockdowns. 4 months he spent locked inside his apartment, and the military would drop one meal off at his front door every day. And that happened to 30 million people. Now, the way we see people like you and I, who refer to ourselves as more aware and awake to what's been happening among the more authoritarian, supposedly liberal governments in the West, we now look back on COVID as an exercise of collaboration between big government and big pharma, and big pharma made a lot of money out of it, and it was, there will be no investigations into what happened because it was all clandestine and to the benefit of everyone except the ordinary citizen. But when I went to China, I realized, yeah, look, China did it too, but why did they? Why, if the CCP is so, the responsible for the Chinese people, why were they so cruel towards the Chinese people during COVID?
Yeah, the CCP. A couple of things about the CCP. First of all, they're always 准确. They're always correct. They don't make mistakes. All right, they're always correct. People need to understand that the Chinese Communist Party never makes mistakes. That's why the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, are not talked about in university. They're not discussed in the media. They're verboten, and you don't challenge the Chinese Communist Party. So, right from the get-go, Xi Jinping snuffed out any news on the pandemic. It was incredibly cynical. The doctors that were whistleblowers were arrested, taken to the local PSB, given a stern warning. In the period, early period, they were scooping it before people really understood the extent of the pandemic, and I knew straight away. I was in a WhatsApp group with a bunch of China expert mates. I was like, and given my background in infection control, I was like, this is different. This is going to be huge. And I was screaming my lungs out, close the borders, stop the planes a week before they did, you know. But the other thing about the CCP is it's very, very controlling. And Xi Jinping has a few nicknames. Jeremy Barmay calls him the chairman of everything. I call him the control freak's control freak. And they shut things down. What they did, and I had friends at the US consulate in Shanghai through the lockdowns. What they did was extraordinary. And the thing that the straw that broke the camel's back was in Xinjiang, there was a fire in a building. And because people were trapped in their own homes, a dozen or so people lost their lives in that fire. And the situation in Shanghai, they could no longer keep a lid on it. And I remember jumping on Sky News at the time. Young people were out in the streets in Shanghai saying, "Da Dao Xi Jinping, Da Dao Gongchangdang," you know, down Xi Jinping, down with the Communist Party. I couldn't believe
Wow.
it. I mean, to do that in this day and age,
Wow. Yeah.
China, China spends as much, they say, although nobody really knows for sure, on watching, surveilling, and arresting its own citizens as it does on defense. So to come out and do that, you know, things had to be really, really bad.
Mm.
Furthermore, they killed the lockdowns on us. They decided up in Beijing, you know, we're going to end the lockdowns. They decided that on a Sunday. They didn't tell any of the hospitals, you know, because why should they? They're the Chinese Communist Party. They don't have to tell
Yeah.
people what's going on and brief them. And so, you know, people go to work at the hospitals on Monday. The COVID pandemic rips through the elderly population of China. Millions of old people succumb to the infection. There's massive queues outside crematoria all over the country, you know. And what really, I mean, some say I might be a bit provocative or whatever. It's like, have we lost our common sense? Have we lost our
Mm.
humanity in talking about these things?
Yeah.
Shame on us if we have. And you know, one of the reasons I am, I do speak truth to these things is, you know, I spent a day in Auschwitz-Birkenau in, I think it was about '99. So I got the blow by blow description of what went down at Auschwitz and Birkenau, you know, how orchestrated, how micro designed it was. And it's really have you been there, Fred?
No, I haven't. No.
Yeah, it's a really numbing experience. But later on that day, I thought to myself, well, I felt somehow compelled to go there and see it myself. And I was trying to think, well, what was the point of the whole exercise? The point of the exercise was if you see this stuff happening on your watch, in your lifetime, it's in your in tray, you speak up about it. And
Yeah.
I said to myself, I made a little promise to myself that you see that, you know, and I'm an equal opportunity offender. I'll go into bat for, you know, Jews in Australia, and I'll go into bat for Uyghurs in China. I don't care. You
Yeah.
know, it's a good Samaritan
Well,
thing, I guess.
I've been to Budapest and been to the what do they call it, the House of Horrors. It's the place where the Red Arrow and which were the local agency for the KGB used to torture people, and it's one of the it's
The-
probably not quite as harrowing as Auschwitz, but it is really disturbing. It's exhausting and disturbing to go
It,
through there and
it
be
is,
in places.
but I think
But speaking of people not speaking up about this, that brings us back to Anthony Albanese. I mean, where's his moral compass?
yeah, well, I mean, just on a similar vein in terms of red carpet state visits, it wasn't that long ago, Fred, that Bashar al-Assad visited Beijing and got the absolute red carpet treatment. And of course, he's holed up in Moscow now. But the Wall Street Journal had an article last week on his on the infamous prison in Damascus, or just outside Damascus, and what went down there. And it's a house of you should read the article. It's a house of horrors on an epic scale. I mean, just horrendous stuff that went on in there, and some people survived it. They'll never be the same.
Mm,
But this is a guy, and you know, Putin's going to Beijing in September, I believe, and he's all buddy buddy. And you know, this is a guy that's shelling apartment buildings
yeah,
in Ukraine.
yeah,
I mean, these people are evil. They're
yeah,
evil. and I just, you know, Albo. Look, I understand the pragmatism. We're going to sell iron ore to China. It's in our interests, and so on. I got no issue with the selling beef and wine and things like that. But you know, to wander up to him, to go up there and wander up and say, you know, it's wonderful to see you. You know, I can't get my head around that. And similarly, I think there's a real lack of, I mean, my postgraduate scholarship was called the China Skills traineeship, courtesy of the taxpayer by DFAT, and I'm grateful for that. And I feel a sense of giving back to my country in terms of talking about these things. But
just finally, Andrew, how do you think Trump has seen this trip by Albo?
So there's a lot of curiosity in this topic in the US right now because of the visit. You know, I've heard people, an ex-World Bank guy in the US said, Australia's changed. It's not the Australia that we're used to. There's a lot of immigrants from China and India coming into the country. They've got a very left-leaning government and a left-leaning prime minister at the moment. So I think people are scratching their heads in the US and saying, you know, is Australia the you know, the Australia that we know and love and have always been able to rely on? And I'm
And
not suggesting,
defended.
yeah, I'm not suggesting we, you know, follow the US blindly wherever it goes. And I think, you know, they made colossal errors in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq, and they're the first to admit that. But at the same time, we need to understand that the US, and I, you know, perhaps my perspective is a little different because I spent a big chunk of my career working for US corporations in Asia, like, excuse me, like GE and Gore, both of which sell to the civilian world and the military world, both of which have successfully prosecuted PRC nationals for stealing their IP. The most famous case was the GE jet engine case, which the FBI busted a couple of years ago, and that's the national sport in China, is stealing Western IP.
Yeah.
But
Well, luckily Australia doesn't have much IP to. What we're selling them is iron ore.
We're selling wool and wheat and iron ore and coal and stuff like that, commodities, right? So I have a bit of a different perspective, and I think the Americans do too, because, you know, historically China has invited world-class companies into their country, learned the special sauce, and then seen them to the door. You know, Apple is you know, I'll come back to Apple in a second. They'll do that to Tesla eventually. GM had a good run for a while there, and now it's, you know, it'll eventually pull out of China. The big telcos, Motorola, and so on, used to have huge operations in China. Nortel, the Canadian telco maker, was the world's biggest maker of you know, switching and telco equipment. No longer exists because Huawei has pilfered their technology at such a scale and put them out of business.
I saw a Huawei store in Shanghai that looked like an Apple store. Obviously, you know, Huawei is pilfering a lot from and Apple. There's been a new book come out which you've talked about. I've seen a documentary associated with it. Apple is trapped in China now. It's pretty much, according to the documentary I saw, it's pretty much financed the CCP. And now it can't get out because all its trained personnel and all its factories are in China. And good luck trying to pull them out because the CCP wouldn't let you.
Yeah, they're weaponizing that. I think that book, Patrick McGee, is a landmark book. I think it's a must read. I've yet to get around to buying it, but it's on my shopping list. I've got so many China books, but yeah, they're not. Apple wants to send people that they've trained in China to India to build capacity. Chinese government's not letting them out of the country. You know, this is what they do. They play the hardest of hardball. And they weaponize their advantage, you know. And we say boo, and we're the worst, you know, the worst in the world. What we ought to be doing is saying, you know, when I talk about this, and I do a bit of public speaking, and I call my presentation the China Challenge. The China Challenge implications for Australia, because it's just as much about us as it is about them. They know who they are. They know what their objectives are, and they go hard at it. Meanwhile, we're muddled. We as countries in the West, UK, US, Australia, we've kind of forgotten who we are, what we stand for, and our leaders are not giving us any vision for where we're going. I like to say in my presentation, can you imagine either the Liberal Party or the Labor Party submitting a 5-year written plan for the country's development and growth? Not in a million years.
Well, I can't imagine them actually submitting principles upon which the country is based. I mean, nobody's really adhering to the Christian principles that we were based upon, and the culture and the spirit of the country seems to be seeping away, and that also goes to the advantage of China.
Yeah, I remember when we were a bit younger, Fred, you and I, there were ads on the telly, that's how we got the country started,
Yeah, yeah.
that sort of
Well,
stuff.
BHP
It's
was the
all
big
climbed the
Australian.
mountain. Yeah, that's right. And we took some pride in all of that. And, now we do the welcome to country. And, I walked across the Harbour Bridge in 2000. It was a great day for reconciliation. I consider Marcia Langton, she's a bit eccentric, Marcia, but I love her and I consider her a friend of mine. I love our Aboriginal brothers and sisters. I want to see them doing better. I want to see them living longer, healthier lives. And that's what I care about. I care about closing the gap. But
Yeah.
we never say at the beginning of these meetings, I pay my respects to, and the Chinese have ancestor worship, by the way, but I digress. But we never say, I pay my respects to the British early settlers, British and Irish early settlers, who gave us the rule of law, who built the Great Ocean Road and the exhibition buildings, those that went to
Exactly.
World War One and World War
Exactly.
Two, that
We've
paid the
forgotten. We have
sacrifice.
no reverence for our own
No,
history.
and
In
one
fact,
of the
schools are teaching us the opposite, that our history is evil, that we were a genocidal colonizer. But that's an interesting point you bring up, and I'll have to finish on this point.
yeah,
That we care for our Indigenous brothers and sisters. The way we have been managing for the past 50 years might be not particularly effective, but we do care about them. Now, you said there's a good chance that by the middle of this century, China will invade. Well, if they do, it's goodbye to the Indigenous, because they will last. They'll be treated worse than the Uyghurs are treated
no question.
in China.
No question.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's what's happening. I mean, I haven't spent much time in the Pacific, but I was in Palau in 2016, I think it was, and they've only got 30,000 people. They're in what they call a compact of free association with the US. They use the US dollar. They were having, plane loads full of people from the PRC coming in, China applying a huge amount of pressure for them to dump Taiwan. You see what happens. If Palau's anything to go by, what happens in the Pacific Island countries is that once they let the PRC in, there's no turning back. Their countries turn on a dime, and in a very short period of time, the locals, who generally in the Pacific are pretty laid back, they find themselves second-class citizens in their own country. And of course, we might not think that's a big deal, and we had Jacinta Ardern running around the Pacific bagging Australia over climate change. The other thing that China's after is, say in the Solomons, is to have a naval presence so it can interdict any action between the Australian and US navies, which was critical in World War II. And of course, some of these PICs, Pacific Island countries, they have a huge special economics, exclusive economic zone, maritime economic zone, and that means China has free reign on fisheries and everything else. So I had this chat with ScoMo a few years ago. We've got skin in the game in the Pacific, and we need to play hardball, which is why I support PNG getting a rugby league team. Are we finishing up on that note, Fred?
That's a good note. That's a good note to finish on. Go the Papua New Guineans. All right.
Yes.
Good on you, mate. All right. Thanks for your time, Andrew.
Great to talk to you.
Cheers, mate.
Cheers.